Hey guys, I am going to talk about mythology today, and especially the myth of the labyrinth. Some of you may know or remember that a couple of weeks ago I organized a vote in one of my videos for you to choose one of the topics I would deal with, and this one, the myth of the labyrinth, won the contest, and I am really happy about that because I enjoy talking about and thinking about mythological tales for the diversity of approaches that they make possible behind apparently compelling but simple stories. There are so many doors that can be opened in terms of history, but also ethnology or psychology, and I would like to tell you about the story itself, but also examine with you the meaning and the enduring popularity of this myth. But don't worry, as usual I will try and to do my best for you to be able to follow these explanations easily. All you need to do is let my voice guide you through this story. I told you that there were several dimensions to the myth, and this is exactly what we are going to see with the myth of the labyrinth. When you look at the mythology, you quickly realize that all the storylines we know that have been used in tales, novels, movies were already present in these mythologic tales. If I take an example that we will see with the myth of the labyrinth, we could talk about one type of storyline, which is the journey of initiation. When I will tell you about Theseus, who enters the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur, the monster who lives inside, we are here in a typical journey of initiation, a tale in which a protagonist, a hero, goes through various tests, and thanks to those tests he discovers the world, and more importantly discovers himself or herself. And this kind of storyline is and has been and still is extremely popular. If you take recent movies such as Avatar or Gravity, these stories that have apparently not much in common, actually share the same thread. You are following one character, a hero, going through an adventurous and emotional journey that is changing him or her, generally for the better, and making him access to a new experience, a new understanding. And we could expand this approach to the vast majority of storylines that structure contemporary novels or movies. But if we go a bit deeper, there is also another dimension of the myths, which is that they are parables, fables too, and they always tell us something about how the men see themselves and what they should or should not do. And we are going to find this dimension again with the story of Icarus in the Labyrinth. I will elaborate on this in a moment. And if we continue to look for other approaches, other angles, we can also see a psychological dimension to the myth, which may explain why they continue to be so appealing centuries after they were invented. All the myths are also implicitly talking about our fears, our hopes, our aspirations. And once again, we will find this dimension in the myth of the Labyrinth, and we find it in many more myths or tales. For example, one of the strongest aspirations that seem to be expressed in myth and tales is the aspiration to rise socially or in terms of power. And we have tons of examples of myth with men that manage to become half gods or to compete with the gods, of peasants that access to nobility by getting married with princesses, or if we take it the other way around, the story of poor women, Cinderella, for example, accessing to nobility. Of course, we could see these archetypal storylines or stories as an illustration of the hope to socially rise. But there is probably something more symbolic to it. One of the deepest aspirations we have inside us is not only to rise in the eyes of others, but also to access a better accomplishment, a higher level of conscience, a connection with a higher dimension of the universe. Some call it intellectual, some call it metaphysical or spiritual, and I think there is something of that unconsciously in this myth, the willingness, the hope, the aspiration to become better versions of ourselves, to find accomplishment through a rise. And these stories are compelling also because they are telling us that this is a possibility and that there can be other dimensions to our beings. But let's focus on the myth of the labyrinth itself. In fact, there are two stories here. For the Greeks, the labyrinth was a construction, a maze that had been built on the island of Crete, and the building had been ordered by the king of Crete, Minos, and the architect of this labyrinth was a Greek man from Athens called Daedalus, who had a son, Icarus. And in the labyrinth, Minos sent a monstrous creature, half man, half bull, called the Minotaur. The first story about the labyrinth is that the architect Daedalus and his son were actually Greek citizens in exile. They were prisoners in Crete and wanted to escape their prison. But they could not do so by land or by sea because they were controlled by Minos. So Daedalus had an idea to create, to make wings with wax and feathers attached to their arms that would make it possible for them to fly and escape Crete. But he told his son to be very cautious when he would be flying and not go too close to the sun, because the heat of the sun could make the wax melt and threaten his capacity to fly. Of course, Icarus did not obey to his father, and as they were starting to fly away from Crete, he got fascinated by the sun and wanted to rise higher and higher until the heat of the sun destroyed his wings. The wax had melted and he lost the feathers, so that he fell and disappeared into the sea. The second story, which is the most famous one, is the story of Theseus, the Minotaur and Ariadne. The myth says that in those times, when the labyrinth existed and the Minotaur lived inside, the city of Athens was under the protectorate, the influence of Crete and Minos, and every 9 years the Athenians had to send a tribute of 7 young men and 7 young women to be sent to the labyrinth and sacrificed to the Minotaur. By the way, when I told you about how these storylines reappear under new forms, you can probably recognize the storyline of the Hunger Games in this myth. But returning to the story, one year Theseus, who was a hero from Athens, decided to retaliate and accompany the 14 young persons that were going to be sacrificed. He arrived in Crete, fell in love with the daughter of Minos, Ariadne, and because she loved him, she gave him a thread, Ariadne's thread, that would make it possible for him to find his way back inside the labyrinth. He would only have to follow the thread. So he entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and apart from Daedalus and Icarus, he was the third and last man to be able to exit alive the labyrinth. In these two stories, as I said before, we are going to find the various dimensions I mentioned before. For example, if we think about parables, fables, we see that the history of Icarus is a perfect example of warning to the youngs in general, young men in particular, of what can happen if they disobey their fathers. But by their fathers you can understand the authority in general, and this is also a warning about the limitations of men. It was possible for Icarus and Daedalus to escape Crete because Daedalus was smart and astute, But Icarus forgot to respect the limitations. He forgot that he was only a man, and this cost him his life. This is something that is very common and strong in the Greek conceptions, the belief that the excess, the excessive trust in oneself is dangerous and should be checked by the society or this kind of myth. There was a concept that I talked about in another video I had made about the myth of Prometheus, that the Greeks called hybris. This inflation, this excess of ambition and ego, bringing disasters to the entire society. And here we are not talking about hybris specifically, but we are talking about the risk of trespassing the limits, and there is a clear warning, a lesson of wisdom in this story of Icarus. The second story with Theseus and the Minotaur is also rich in potential interpretations. It is a story about how intelligence, the smarts, can fight and win against the adversity, how the human mind can help find solutions to everything with this good idea of the thread, making it possible to find his way back inside the labyrinth. But on a deeper level, we find this storyline of the journey of initiation I was mentioning earlier, with tests inside what can be seen as a big metaphor. Of course, the labyrinth is a construction, a building in reality, says the myth. But we can also have a second reading of this if we take into account the fact that the journey of initiation also is an inner journey for the hero. And here the labyrinth can be seen as a metaphor of the mind, its complexity, the difficulty for the man to know their own mind, and the fact that something monstrous, something half man, half beast, the Minotaur, is hiding somewhere, like a core or a remain of bestiality that haunts our minds. And the story shows us how facing this bestiality with the help of intelligence, the thread, and the help of love too, it is Ariadne that makes it possible for Theseus to win, make it possible to fight and ultimately kill or control this inner bestiality and become more human or access a higher level of conscience and control. And I think even unconsciously, this is what makes this story of the Minotaur and Theseus so appealing, and that has made it endure the passing of time. It corresponds to a very deep aspiration that we have, and maybe it has also been formulating in a semi-conscious way concepts that the psychology or even the psychoanalysis would start naming centuries later, like the it in Freud's work. As you know, Freud is the inventor of the psychoanalysis, a social science that has lost quite a lot of grip on psychology now, but still that initiated concepts and clinical approaches that are still used and that are the basis of modern psychology. And this term of the it is what Freud used to name this inner animal pulsion that we have, and that maybe even unconsciously the Greeks were already starting to name when they invented this myth of the labyrinth. And I would make one last remark before leaving you here. You see how significant the stories can be. Of course, they are entertaining. This is what we like superficially in them. They can be fun, pleasant, but behind that, and especially these stories that we find particularly interesting without sometimes knowing precisely why, there is probably something deeper. Their capacity to enter in contact with our inner and sometimes unconscious aspirations, hopes, the questions we have inside us. And there are ways for us, like for our ancestors, to find reassurance and sometimes answers to our questions. I hope, as usual, that you found this moment pleasant and interesting, and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.